What regulatory instruments do governments have at their disposal, and how do these instruments compare? Let's look into the different options applied to the consumption of meat. Meat consumption in the West is unsustainable, and governments across the West want to do something about the consumption of meat. But what instruments do they have available, and how do they decide which instrument to use? That is what this knowledge clip is about. Let's first look into what assessment criteria you could apply, and thereafter to the different instruments that you have available. As to assessment criteria, you can look into the administrative cost of a different regulatory instrument. A system of license and permits requires a lot of checking by government administrators, whereas information disclosure demands far less activity from government side. Hence, the administrative costs differ between these regulatory options. Some options actually bring benefits, think about taxes, or cost additional resources, if you think about subsidies. In comparing the different options that governments have at their disposal, the monetary implications for the government budget can be one factor to decide which option is most effectively used to address the societal issue. Second, performance failure. For some societal issues, you just want to get the thing done. Non-performance is not an option. Think about safety of nuclear power plants, where there's a very low tolerance for issues in safety. On the other hand, our example of the day, meat consumption, it may be comparably more acceptable not to meet the targets that the government set. Non-performance is more allowed in some regulatory structures than in others, and hence the tolerance for non-performance weighs in when you decide which measure to adopt. Third, some measures have more information requirements than others. The government needs to decide what particular activity to regulate, to tax, or to set norms for. The regulator may know more or less about the issue at hand, and that informs the extent to which different different regulatory structures can be effective. If you want to design a tax system, you need to really specifically know what to tax, at what rate and at what level. For a system of permits, regulators can decide their criteria based on initial applications that come in. So the information requirements are stronger for a system of taxes as compared to one of prior approval. And the extent to which a government has information about the issue and what should be done to address it informs the regulatory instrument that best fits the issue at hand. Finally, some regulatory instruments leave room for private parties to innovate. Do you want to allow farmers to improve their production processes to ensure, for example, a better life for their livestock? Or do you just want to ban the production of meat in its entirety? The question of whether you want to allow market participants to innovate, or whether you want to ban a particular activity in its entirety, informs the regulatory instrument that is optimally chosen. Hence, when you compare different regulatory instruments, the administrative cost, or the cost and benefit that the instrument brings, is taken into account. The extent to which you allow the problem not to be addressed by the regulatory instrument, the information requirements that you need to fulfill upfront, how much do you need to know, and finally the extent to which you want to allow market participants to innovate. These are 4 criteria to look at when comparing the different types of information, the different types of regulatory instruments that you can implement. Now, let's look at the different regulatory instruments that a government has. First, the home turf for the economist, taxes and subsidies. With taxes and subsidies, governments use their fiscal policy, so the budget, to make the relative prices of sustainable and unsustainable options, desirable and undesirable options, different. So to make an unsustainable option less attractive for consumers. You can implement this, for example, by having a tax imposed on meat, or by reducing value-added taxes on vegetarian alternatives. Also, you could subsidize suppliers of sustainable alternatives, so let's say suppliers of vegetarian meals, or have taxes imposed on the farmers that produce meat. The information requirements for taxes and subsidies are quite high. For example, you need to know what you consider meat and what not. You need to decide what tax rate applies. Is the 5% difference between the prices enough to get consumers to change their minds? You also need to be aware of the possibility to waste resources. If you subsidize the production of vegetarian meals, or if you would reduce the tax levied on vegetarian options, then that tax also accrues, those benefits also accrue to consumers who would already choose vegetarian options if the tax wouldn't be there. So part of your tax is wasted on consumers who would already make the decision if the policy would not be in place. While information requirements may be high for taxes, the benefit of taxes and subsidies is that it allows private parties to innovate. So sometimes you see that nascent industries require subsidies from governments to realize the scale needed for an efficient production. With taxes and subsidies, consumers are still able to buy meat, and you may be willing to pay a higher price for the same product than they did before. In that sense, government will have collected taxes on unsustainable choices, but you wouldn't do anything about the consumption of meat in society. Enhanced taxes, if not set at a prohibitive high level, leave room for malperformance of the policy. The policy may just not address the issue. The second regulatory instrument is information disclosure. Sometimes consumers may not be aware of the downside, the negative effects of their behavior, and informing them about the consequences of their meat consumption for animal welfare, for example, or for deforestation, may already make them change their mind. At least some consumers, especially those who would already be willing to consider vegetarian options, might be effectively targeted with an information disclosure campaign. While information disclosures are relatively cheap and has administrative costs are low, and also do not distort the market equilibrium, they have a high risk of malperformance. To the extent that consumers were already aware of the information provided or do not receive the information provided, then the information disclosure will not lead to different consumer outcomes. A related set of policy instruments, which I will not get into any further, is that of nudging, where you change the choice architecture to the situation in which a decision is made. You might consider presenting vegetarian and non-vegetarian options differently to consumers. I have a separate video on nudging, to which I will link here or there. A system of licenses or permits may also help to address particularly concerns about animal welfare and meat consumptions. Governments may require farmers to obtain a particular license and may set standards that farmers need to meet before they are able to obtain the license. Now, of course, the administrative costs of such a solution are extensive. Regulators would need to visit farms to check whether animal welfare is really okay at that specific farm. But if governments do not really have the information required to set For example, appropriate taxes, permits and licenses may be an effective way to remove at least the rotten apples from the meat production industry. Prior approval entails that producers need to obtain a license or a permit to allow them to produce or market meat products. While the administrative costs of a system of license and permits are high, the risk of performance failure, depending of course on how the regulator interprets this task, is lower. Because the government needs to vouch for every single producer of meat before they can start their production, the risk that a farm does not obey the quality standards that governments have in mind is lower as compared to a system of taxes or subsidies or information disclosures. Moreover, as compared to standards, which we will talk about in a bit, a system of licenses and permits may have more flexible standards. So it may not be specified to a large extent what conditions producers need to meet in order to obtain a license. The final instrument that we're comparing here is that of standards. A government may set either specification or performance standards that producers are to meet when they want to bring their products to the market. Governments may impose specification standards on farmers, forbidding them to use particular production technologies. You may forbid the use, for example, of stables that have fewer than a particular area designated for a single animal to live on. Such specification standards prescribe what production processes are allowed and which are not, or which ingredients a firm is allowed to use in its production and which is not allowed. Performance standards have requirements as to the performance of a particular product. Whereas in the specification standard you prescribe that a particular ingredient is not to be used, the performance standard says that you, firm, are allowed to produce this product as long as it meets this or that standard. A specification standard would, for example, say that meat is not allowed in the production of meals, whereas a performance standard would have requirements as to the nutritional value of a particular meal. And the parties in the market, firms in the market, would, with a performance standard, still be allowed to use certain animal ingredients, whereas that would be forbidden with specification standards. Standards, like taxes, have high information requirements. You need to know what to regulate on, so what standard to set, and at what level that standard should be set. Taxes and subsidies, information disclosures, systems of prior approval, and performance standards have different information requirements from governments, allow firms to differentially allow firms to innovate, have a higher or lower risk of performance and failure, and differ in the cost that they bring to governments. Other regulatory instruments not discussed in this clip would be that government take over the food industry and start to produce food according to its standards itself, or that through a system of public franchising it would sell the right to produce meat to private actors. But these are less straightforward regulatory instruments if you talk about reducing the consumption of meat. In practice, we often observe a combination of regulatory instruments to address a single societal problem. If you want to get people to eat more meat, then governments often include information campaigns, but also different VAT rates may apply, and industry is confronted with sets of standards that need to be met in the production process. And together, this set of instruments is intended to address the societal issue at hand.